Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and today we're looking at Joe Biden's first 100 days in the White House. What kind of presidency is this, and what is its likely impact to be? My name is Jennifer Hudson, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Welcome indeed to this new series of our podcast, Series 3. Over the coming weeks, we'll be looking at political riots, how to run an effective bureaucracy, and the state of the union here in the UK, along many other important topics. This week, we're focusing on politics in the United States. President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris have been in office for a little over 100 days now. This session's going to look at how it's going. Has Joe Biden been Sleepy Joe as predicted? Has he pursued the path of moderation and coalition building that has characterized much of his very long career in politics? Or has he turned out to be much more of a radical than many of us expected? What role is being performed by Vice President Harris? And meanwhile, how have Republicans responded to their defeat? And just what is Donald Trump up to now that he's out of office and banned from Twitter? I'm delighted to have my usual experts back with me today. Let me introduce them to you. Dr. Thomas Gift is Associate Professor of Political Science at UCL and Founding Director of the UCL Center on US Politics. Dr. Julie Norman is Lecturer in Politics and International Relations and Deputy Director of the US Center on US Politics. And Dr. Colin Provost is Associate Professor of Public Policy and Director of our MSc in Public Policy here in the department. Thomas, Julie, and Colin, welcome back to UCL Uncovering Politics, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say on Biden's first 100 days. To kick us off, I want to start by asking you your reflections on the first 100 days. So if you had to sum up the period since inauguration on the 20th of January in a few sentences, what say you? Julie.
Well, I'd say it certainly has been a transformational shift. With Trump, everything was quite big on performance and rather light on policy. For Biden, we've really seen the opposite. He hasn't been especially vocal or visible, but he's pushing a very big, bold, progressive agenda, tapping the brakes a bit on rhetoric, but hitting the gas on policy, if you will. And there's been some comparisons of Biden to FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. I'd see him more likened to Teddy Roosevelt's quote, speak softly and carry a big stick, but carrying a big agenda with Biden so far.
Thanks, Julie. Thomas, what's your view on the first 100 days?
I'd make three quick points. First, I think Biden did about as much as he could have hoped with COVID-19, including more than doubling his target of 100 million vaccines in the first 100 days, as well as pushing through this very massive $1.9 trillion pandemic relief package. Second, I would say that Biden has been much more aggressive in proposing an expanded role for the federal government than most experts predicted. Enormous price tags attached to both his $2 trillion infrastructure plan and $1.8 trillion American Families Plan. I don't think that those numbers should get lost in the shuffle. They're astronomical proposed spending increases. And lastly, Biden has not substantially reduced, or in my view, even moderately reduced some of these historic levels of partisan polarization that we saw emerge out of the Trump years. I don't think that's necessarily his fault, but I think that's just the point at which we find ourselves in the current moment.
Colin, your view on the first 100 days?
Thanks, Jennifer. I largely agree with a lot of the points that Julie and Thomas made. I mean, President Biden's put down the social media and press conference megaphone that Donald Trump used so prolifically when he was president. But while doing so, he's passed and proposed sweeping legislation that's unapologetically liberal, with the potential to transform the economy, infrastructure, income support programs, education, public health programs. He's done so with a limited eye towards bipartisanship. He would like to work with Republicans, but he's not going to hold out indefinitely. He has limited patience on that front. So overall, I'd say he's seeking to make radical change to the economy and society, but with a quiet tone and temperament.
Thank you, the three of you, for those opening thoughts. Thomas mentioned the vaccine rollout, and I think that's a really useful place to start. So it was going so well that Biden doubled his pledge to 200 million vaccines in the first 100 days. I wanted to ask you, Julie, how much has the success of the vaccine rollout in the US shaped perceptions of Biden and his leadership, his new administration? I mean, I think it's worth commenting that this is a recent poll suggested that there was a 75% approval rate of the Biden administration's rollout here. And it just makes me think this is probably one of the very few areas where he is going to get bipartisan support, alluding to some of the comments that Colin just made. So how do you think this might have shaped views of the Biden administration early on?
Well, you're exactly right, Jennifer, that how the COVID vaccine rollout proceeded was going to be crucial for how people viewed Biden's first 100 days and indeed his administration going forward. And the administration was very key to hit the ground running with that, as we saw doubling the goal of vaccinating 200 million people per day over those first 100 days and hitting that goal. And as you said, that really did affect some of his approval ratings. His overall approval ratings right now are hovering at about 55%. But when people are asked specifically about his handling of COVID, it's upwards of 88% of Democrats and even 55% of Republicans. So averaging around 68% of approval of that issue in particular. So that is the one issue where he has the highest bipartisan support. And we see it really being what's driven a lot of his initial legislative agendas as well.
Thanks, Julie. Let's move to that legislative agenda now, because Biden has been particularly active, both in terms of passing a stimulus package, but also major pieces of legislation. And as Thomas pointed out, pieces of legislation that have very, very hefty price tags. Thomas, can you sum up what Biden's legislative activity has involved?
Sure. In addition to a flurry of executive actions, there have been three big bills that he has proposed, one of which has passed, the pandemic relief bill, which was roughly $1.9 trillion. It included $1,400 checks, also included money for the vaccine rollout to state and local governments and to other entities to try to kickstart the economy and stimulate it in the wake of the pandemic. Two other bills that he has proposed have not passed, but he made headlines by really marketing these in his 100-day speech. One was this $2 trillion infrastructure bill. One of the criticisms there is that a lot of the money that he says is infrastructure, Republicans aren't actually designating as infrastructure. So this does include money for roads and bridges, but it also includes money for a lot of other things, broadband, internet, water delivery, et cetera. And then the last bill, which is also not passed, is the American Families Plan. That's roughly $1.8 trillion. And it's kind of being billed as the second part of the infrastructure bill. It's designed to revitalize American communities. There's a lot of money in it for childcare, for schools, and other things. I think it would constitute a pretty substantial revision of the American Social Compact in the sense that it would really increase the role of the state in everyday lives of citizens, not just among the poor, but also the middle and working classes. So I'm not sure if Biden necessarily expects to get all of these through. I think what he's trying to do right now is stake out a strong bargaining position and then compromise. With that said, I think Biden is taking a gamble. He's betting that Americans think that government is the key engine by which to ensure future American prosperity. And there's a huge political argument about that. It's a debatable premise. And also by going so big at the outset, he's taking a risk that he's not going to alienate moderates in Congress to the extent that they just walk away from the negotiating table. So this is where Democrats are right now. I think he feels empowered, particularly by the two wins in the runoff elections, which gave Democrats de facto control of both chambers of Congress. And we'll see where he's able to go from here.
Thomas mentioned the kind of big nature of some of these proposals and the fact that this is really being driven now by the US government as the driver of prosperity for America. And Colin, I want to get your views on what this means in terms of kind of their radical shape or nature. Is this the death of Reaganomics, the idea that the government does very little and that it stimulates at the top and trickles down into the rest of society? Or is just this more of a departure from fairly progressive policies that we might have seen under Clinton and Obama? So how radical are these first set of proposals from Biden?
I would say they're pretty radical. They represent a sincere, unapologetic attempt for Biden to implement his vision for several policies at once in America: climate change, education, economic recovery, healthcare, infrastructure, the things that have been addressed by Thomas and Julie already. And for Biden, many of them are interlocking as well, right? By tackling poverty and education, he thinks he can also help with climate and environmental justice. And he's using the whole of government to deal with these things. They do differ in some meaningful ways from policies of Clinton and Obama as well. Clinton did fancy himself to some extent a smaller government Democrat. He tried to govern as a more fiscally careful president. He was famous for once saying that the era of big government was over. He collaborated with Republicans on a welfare reform bill that many Democrats were not in favor of when it passed in 1996. Obama didn't necessarily share all of those beliefs, but he was very eager to approach his goals in a bipartisan manner, and he did that early on. And many Democrats look back now and say that because Obama wanted to do things in a bipartisan manner, the stimulus bill in 2009 was too small. That Democrats wasted too much time waiting for Republicans. And so this is supposedly one of the lessons that Joe Biden has learned. He has paid some lip service to the idea of bipartisanship, but he's not going to hold out indefinitely for it. And he's not, it's not his main goal here, right? His main goal is passing these very large sweeping bills, right? So that's the main goal for him. They are quite radical. And if they pass, they have the power to transform quite a bit. In terms of Reaganomics, Democrats have never really believed in supply side economics, especially over the last 20 years. That's had less and less traction. There's no reason to think it won't make a comeback should a Republican become president in 2024, because tax cuts remain one of the core policy goals of the Republican Party in general, and the idea that you can at least claim to be boosting economic growth by doing so remains popular. So in that regard, it's never quite the death of Reaganomics, but you won't find any place for Reaganomics in the Biden administration. That's for sure.
Julie, I want to kind of press you on what this means then for how radical Biden can be. And Colin made the case that this isn't about necessarily seeking bipartisanship. This is about kind of going big and maybe compromising later on if you have to. But the question to you is how far can Biden go? How far do you think Biden does want to go with his legislative agenda?
Yeah, well, as both Thomas and Colin mentioned, he's putting forward these big bills, I think, knowing that some of them are going to have to compromise. And what the Biden administration is banking on right now is that there's a lot of public support for many of these policies and proposals, even though there's not a lot of support from Republicans on Capitol Hill. We know, of course, that both houses are quite divided. The Democrats have a very slim majority in the House, and the Senate is split 50-50. So in order to actually get anything through Congress, it's going to be difficult. They were able to get the first stimulus bill through a process called reconciliation, which just requires 51 majority vote in the Senate rather than a 60 vote requirement. They won't be able to use that process for everything. And even the ones where they can, it's a challenge because the Democratic Party itself has a very wide range of viewpoints in it. And Biden has to negotiate within his party as well as across party lines. He won't be able to get some of the more moderate and conservative Democrats on board with some of these proposals either. So there's going to be some compromises made within the Democratic Party as well as perhaps across the aisle.
Let's switch gears and I think talk about maybe some kind of deeper social and cultural issues in the US. And Julie, I'll stay with you here. Can you give us your thoughts on the Biden administration's ability to address, to heal some of the divisions in American society now? How will Biden be able to deal with some of the challenges that are facing Americans, particularly ongoing tensions over police violence in the US? But we came into the Biden administration with some really, really deep-seated issues around race, around justice, and around inequality. What's your view on Biden's ability to get a handle on those?
Yeah, I would say that the level of divisions in the United States on some of these issues are going to take definitely longer than 100 days and longer even than one administration or president to resolve some of these issues. What we've seen Biden do so far is really lean into these policy agendas, many that have proposals in them that will lift up Americans from all different kinds of walks of life. Biden himself hasn't spoken a lot directly to issues of race in particular, but he has made some comments that were notable. He made a public address after the George Floyd verdict several weeks ago, and he also alluded quite directly in his joint address to Congress last week, saying that there needed to be more attention to addressing racism. But it's important to note in that same speech to Congress, he also noted that most police officers are serving their communities honorably as well. So with Biden, in terms of trying to address police violence against people of color, he, I think, is trying to find some kind of middle ground there that addresses real concerns, but also doesn't alienate law enforcement at the same time. He's leaving most of that policy drive to Congress. There's already been a bill that passed the House in a Justice and Policing Act, but the one that we'll really be paying attention to is the one that's being negotiated in the Senate between Republican Tim Scott, the only Black Republican senator, and Cory Booker, a Black Democratic senator. I think it's also important to note that Biden has authorized his Justice Department to restart federal probes into local police departments to see if there are practices or patterns of police violence or if these are isolated incidents. So this is a model that was used in the Obama administration, as well as the George W. Bush administration, but was stopped under Trump. Biden has reallowed the Justice Department to restart those investigations, starting in Minneapolis and Louisville, where we've seen some of these recent events.
Significant departure from the Trump administration, where it seemed that you know, certainly some of Trump's efforts were to kind of stoke division as a way of ensuring and building his base, compared to what we've seen, as you've outlined really carefully there with Biden. Let's move to a different issue. And Colin, you've worked and thought a lot around climate change and the environment. And here's a case where Biden sounds radically different from Trump on climate change. How different are the policy outcomes going to be in practice, do you think?
Right. Well, I think how different they are in practice will depend to some extent, some largely significant extent on how he does with the infrastructure bill. Biden is indeed radically different from Trump and on climate and environmental policy. He sees climate change as an existential threat, which he's aggressively addressing. And the reason why I think it comes down to the infrastructure bill to a large extent, or to infrastructure policy more broadly, is that Joe Biden really sees climate as something that he needs to treat as a carrot, right? It needs to be dealt with more as a carrot rather than using the regulatory stick. And so he's been repeatedly trying to convince the American public of the potential for generation of millions of jobs in clean energy and infrastructure investment. In particular, he's talked about lots of union jobs, good paying union jobs, and this shows his attempt as well to win back Obama supporters that also voted for Trump, right? So he's trying to frame climate policy as an opportunity to create lots of jobs rather than something that will cost the economy, which is something that Democrats have done a little bit more in the past. And that was partly because cleaner energy, solar power, those sorts of things were a little bit more out of reach economically. That's no longer the case. Now you can make a case that there's a lot of clean energy uses that can replace fossil fuels rather readily, right? Or at least more readily than in the past. So that's why he's really emphasizing jobs rather than regulation or even carbon taxes. Most economists would agree that putting a price on carbon should be a central feature of any real climate plan, but Biden's been pretty much silent on this, and one of the reasons why is that Republicans in the past have usually then started to introduce the language of job-killing regulations if you talk about carbon taxes or even a cap and trade program. So he hasn't gone down that path, even though it's something that at least among academics and perhaps the American public would generate a lot of consensus, right? So he's really stuck to the language of using climate as a carrot, not a stick, and that it can generate lots of jobs, preferably. He also knows that passing any sort of legislation on climate with such slim majorities in the House and Congress is going to be difficult. It's difficult to see how you're going to do that with reconciliation. There's virtually no way to see how he's going to introduce a big bill with 60 votes in the Senate. Introducing new rules in the EPA rulemaking will be done. We've already seen that happen a little bit. They've introduced a new bill rule the other day on tackling hydrocarbons, excuse me. But here as well, you have Republican state attorneys general who lie in wait, ready to sue, to challenge those. And with a newly emboldened conservative judiciary as well, or a more conservative judiciary after the Trump administration, Republican AGs have a more favorable venue there as well for challenging rules, right? So these are all reasons why Biden wants to look at it from the point of view of we need to pass infrastructure that can bring climate in, rather than looking at it as like regulations which are going to be which are going to be challenged vigorously by Republican officials, elected and otherwise.
Colin, I just want to ask one final question. I mean, you've talked a lot about how this works kind of internally, domestically for US politics. What do you think is going to be the difference in terms of a Biden administration and US leadership on climate when we look at the kind of global context? How much will that signal matter to other countries when we think about COP coming up in the autumn?
I think that the Biden administration will use all of its tools available, just as it's used this kind of whole of government approach at home, trying to introduce climate considerations into cost benefit analysis, procurement, all sorts of things. They're going to do that as well with John Kerry, with looking at trade, looking at investment, and getting other countries to think about this. Obviously, that's going to be easy to see the European Union as allies, less so with other countries. I think some of the challenge is going to be how to work with China, right? Given the delicate relationship the United States has with China on that front, how to figure out how to get India to burn less coal will be important as well. So they'll look at all different possibilities on that front. But yes, that's certainly going to be at least as large a challenge abroad as the ones they're facing at home.
Thanks, Colin. Thomas, we've been talking a lot about Biden and Kamala Harris and their first 100 days, but let's pause and turn to the other side of the aisle and think about Republicans and how they have responded and reacted, both to the loss of the presidency and indeed the Senate. But can you give us a kind of general sense of how have Republicans responded in the last 100 days?
Well, I think that Republicans are reacting to defeat in a number of ways. One is by not accepting the defeat. In Arizona, for example, right now there's still an ongoing Republican-led effort to audit the state's electoral outcomes, despite no evidence of vote rigging. Trump continues to maintain, of course, that he didn't lose in 2020, and polling data suggests that a non-trivial or even large fraction of rank-and-file GOP voters hold that opinion. Another way that Republicans are reacting is by looking ahead, I think, to 2022 and 2024. And here, personally, I'm convinced that any reports of Trump's political demise are exaggerated. I think if Trump does decide to run for president again, it's hard to see him not winning the nomination. And even if he doesn't, it's hard to see whoever does carry that mantle next for the GOP not being Trumpian in some notable respects. I think there have even been some arguments, which I do find compelling, that the pro-Trump wing of the Republican Party has radicalized even further since the election. The thesis there is, ironically, Trump actually served as kind of a restraining force for hardline GOP voters because they felt a degree of safety and complacency with their person in the White House. And now that he's gone, they see this ideological war in the US as even more high stakes, even more dire, which is potentially led them to adopt an even further right agenda. So takeaway from me is that Trumpism continues to have staying power. None of those underlying problems that led to Trump's rise have dissipated in the last few months. And if anything, they've probably grown even more pronounced.
Let's focus in on something that's been getting quite a lot of press and attention and debate in the US, and that is that Republican administrations in some states have been enacting legislation designed to suppress the votes of Democratic leading parts of the population. How worried should we be at this move to make voting more restrictive or more difficult?
Yeah, it's a good question. The allegations of suppressing the vote are something that we definitely need to take seriously. I think our general impulse should always be to try to make elections more inclusive and to ensure that everyone who is eligible can vote is able to do so. Of course, the long legacy of discrimination against African Americans, especially in the South, is something that carries immense historical weight. I think what's happening in Georgia, especially, which has kind of been at the forefront of some of these debates, and which has sparked a lot of backlash, including action by various corporate entities like Major League Baseball pulling out of Atlanta, it's clearly impactful. I think it has greater thrust given that it's occurring against the backdrop of this social movement in the U.S. right now with Black Lives Matter and other calls for social equity. I mean, I'm not an expert on voting laws. It wouldn't surprise me, though, if some of these issues have gotten distorted through the media. I mean, Biden claimed that this is Jim Crow on steroids. To me, that's really inflammatory language. It seriously dilutes how bad Jim Crow laws actually are. Biden's description of the Georgia voting law got 4 Pinocchios in the Washington Post. So for me, it's a legitimate debate to have about what protections we should impose to ensure electoral integrity and what social responsibilities are reasonable to expect of voters when it comes to voter ID laws, for instance. But of course, that needs to be balanced against these concerns about disparate impact and voter disenfranchisement, which are very serious and need to be taken seriously. I think Republicans are way too casual about these kinds of things. I'm not convinced that those serious debates are actually going to happen in the current moment because politics are so fraught and both sides are just digging in. And so I'm not particularly optimistic that a whole lot is going to come from this. I think Republicans are going to continue to push the same line about electoral fraud, despite the fact that there was no evidence that this was widespread. And I think Democrats are, of course, going to combat it and call it various things.
That's going to, I think you're right, Thomas, that's going to continue to play out over the months and years ahead and on up into the next general election. Colin, we've not talked a lot about Trump, but a little bit. Can you give us an insight of what is Trump up to now? What do we expect from him in the months and years ahead? It's been noticeably quieter on Twitter and indeed on Facebook. Will those bans stand? Will he find a new way to reach out and talk to his base and the American public?
The honest answer in terms of what he's up to right now is I'm not really sure, right? I know he has the occasional speaking engagement. He does, get out to rile up the base from time to time. But one important point there, and this comes back to what Thomas was saying, is that might not matter that much because he still does hold so much sway over the Republican Party. And I think, this time next year, it's going to be really interesting to see a lot of the primaries play out in a lot of states with, people running for governor, for senator, for House seats, and to see what sort of fealty you have to preach towards Donald Trump in order to get elected in the Republican Party. Now, the way that primaries have worked, particularly in the Republican Party, just moving further and further towards the right a lot of the time in these kind of ideological purity tests, especially since 2010, there's a lot of reason to think that he's going to continue to hold sway in that regard, and that he, his message, his somewhat anti-democratic message, still the belief that what happened on January 6th was justifiable somehow. That these things that are going to influence who runs, and are going to influence who runs and whether they win or not. One possible exception, I've seen some things written about Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota. She might be, talked about as a potential presidential contender in 2024. It'd be interesting to see if she can be somebody who appeals to Trump supporters while maybe dialing back the rhetoric of January 6th and that sort of thing a little bit. But one thing we're supposed to hear this week about whether Trump will be allowed back on Facebook, right? He's permanently banned from Twitter, but he may be allowed back on Facebook. If that happens, we know that the megaphone is one of his favorite things, right? The social media megaphone. So if he is allowed back on Facebook, I think that's going to have a significant impact on the ability for him to keep having a big influence over Republican voters and be a potential kingmaker in terms of who's running in primary elections next year. So that's going to be an important thing to see. And in terms of what sort of broader influence he'll have, I think we're going to know a lot more with that in the spring of 2022, looking at all these primary elections then.
Julie, I want to close us out thinking about Vice President Kamala Harris. Many expected that given Biden's age, that she would play a very active and prominent role in the new administration. Has that been the case?
Well, Jennifer, I think that Harris is still defining her role a bit. We do know that the way Biden was with Obama, Harris has been to Biden in the sense that she is the last person in the room with him on many major decisions, whether that's domestic or on foreign policy. And I think that's important for this position to be somewhat streamlined across decision-making and policy and not pigeonholed into certain portfolios. With that said, some areas where she is taking a bit more of a leadership role is first in trying to deal with the immigration challenge, which I think is going to be an already a large issue, but increasingly challenging issue for this administration. She's been tasked with a very challenging role of leading diplomatic efforts to stem the flow of migrants from Central America in particular. That's going to be challenging, but it's one that she, I think, is well positioned to take on. She's also been tasked to lead on some other elements to the National Space Council, which Mike Pence also led when he was vice president, and a couple other areas. But I think the important thing is, again, that she is involved in a lot of the decisions and isn't just seen to be tokenistic on gender or race. She's been kind of asked to respond to some of these different issues that we've been seeing, but it's crucial, I think, that's not what she's been limited to. Yes, she's speaking to those, but she's involved in many other aspects of the administration's decision-making as well.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Colin. And thank you, Thomas, for your insights on US politics and how they are changing. We've heard about a radical Biden and a very active first 100 days. We've talked about the role that he will play in terms of climate, on racial divisions in the US, and indeed about the role of Trump and the Republicans and what that means for how we contest and do politics in the coming months. Thank you again for your time, and I'm sure we're going to be back here again, hopefully in 6 months, 12 months, to talk about major pieces of legislation. We've only scratched the surface, so we'll try again in a few months' time. Next week, we're going to be looking at a fascinating new piece of research by our colleague Alex Hartman, who explores whether informal mechanisms can help resolve disputes in deeply divided societies, and if so, what outside organizations can do to help promote them. Remember, if you want to make sure you don't miss out on our future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is to subscribe, and you can do so on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Jennifer Hudson. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you very much for listening.